welcome to the Non-Reformist Reforms. We'll be talking about public banking, worker co-ops, community land trusts, and participatory budgeting, all examples of non-reformist reforms. I'm Emily Kawano. I'll be the moderator today, and we're excited to have as guests, we're hoping, Naveen Agrawal from the California Public Banking Alliance, Manklang of the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, Lydia Lopez from the California Community Land Trust Network, and Ingrid Haftel from the Participatory Budgeting Project. It is possible. We are, a minute ago, we were missing 2 people. And so if need be, David Cobb will be standing in for Naveen to talk about public banking. And as a co-op developer myself, I'll be standing in for Mo. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully they show up. So just a little bit about today's webinar. Maybe some people didn't tune into yesterday's sessions on that started off talking about, well, what are non-reformist reforms? What we're talking about are reforms. It might be policies, it might be institutions, it might be practices, it might be structures that are building the way towards a new system of post-capitalism, and in our language, to solidarity economy. So just a regular reform would be something that is actually trying to fix capitalism. And in the solidarity economy space, we are very clear that we don't believe that we can get to that more just and sustainable and democratic, equitable world by reforming capitalism. There are too many intrinsic, inherent dynamics within capitalism that will prevent us from ever getting there. So we believe we have to move beyond capitalism. So that's what a non-reformist reform would be, something that's really working towards fundamental system change beyond capitalism. And so I am going to move into a brief introduction of myself, and then each speaker will have 3 to 5 minutes to talk about their work and how their work is moving us down this path towards towards system change, towards a solidarity economy. And I will introduce each person right before they speak so that you don't have to remember 4 bios. So again, my name is Emily Kawano. I am a founder and currently the co-coordinator of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network. I'm an economist by training, and my day job is I'm the co-director of Wellspring Cooperative. We're a nonprofit in Springfield, Massachusetts. We're building a network of worker co-ops in Springfield's underserved communities. And we're also supporting solidarity economy initiatives in the region. So with that, so let me just check because I can't see everybody. Do we have Naveen yet?
We do have Naveen.
Hey.
Excellent. Do we have Mo?
Not yet.
Okay, so let me go ahead and invite you, Naveen. Welcome. I'm glad you made it. To start, Naveen serves on the board of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network and is a leader in the California Public Banking Alliance. He has worked in affordable housing project management in San Francisco's Mission District, as well as for the city of Los Angeles. He's currently employed as an analyst and affordable housing underwriter for Union Bank. And Naveen is also an avid cyclist, and I love this, an aspiring cool uncle to his 3 nieces and nephews. So welcome, Naveen. You've got 3 to 5 minutes to talk about your work, and also if you can talk a little bit about how this is a non-reformist reform. How is this getting us to a solidarity economy?
Certainly. Thank you, Emily. I'm sorry to run late. Can everyone hear me well? Great. You know, I now have 5 nieces and nephews, so I should update my bio. Time flies. I've been working in affordable housing for about 8 years, and I came to public banking specifically as a movement because affordable housing is one of many industries that requires there to be a profit motivation for the provision of a good. Within affordable housing, for which affordable housing is built or preserved is a tax credit to the extent that a private investor, usually a bank, has a tax liability. They're investing in affordable housing. To the extent that they have less of a tax liability because the tax code changes, then they have investment in affordable housing. So the profit motivation of large corporations is directly tied to our ability to provide for affordable housing. And that to me is odd, to say the least. It's a system that requires you to kind of suspend disbelief that like profit, the free market, quote unquote, will provide. And I think what it's in the vein of decolonizing economics and a non-reformist reform, you have to unpack that assumption a little bit, and you step back from the idea of a free market in the first place. Because a free market, the market in general, is a construct. It's a construct of governance that provisions, tax credits that provisions, profit, et cetera, et cetera. So if you take that step back, then you get to the point where what could the market be? And that's when I think you start to see the idea of a non-reformist reform or the contours of it. Specifically, look right now at the current banking, the current moment for the banking industry. You see banks that are struggling. I was reading an article in Bloomberg this morning about how small businesses are finding it harder to find a loan than they have in 10 years. You're going to see what a cascading effect from banks that didn't have an adequate deposits now suddenly not being able to lend. And you'll see that first and foremost with access to credit, specifically among people and like borrowers who have always had the most marginal access to credit. So you can take your small businesses, you can take your community land trusts, you can take you can take like jobs from the Green New Deal, small businesses in more exploratory industries, in alternative energy, for instance. You see a credit tightening across the board, and this is exactly where a public bank comes in. A public bank exists to do the kind of lending, to do the kind of activity that private banks either don't do or won't do or don't really want to do. Thank you, Emily. And that is the space that this movement was born from. To give a little bit of broader context, in 2017, Trinity Tran, who founded the California Public Banking Alliance, led a movement to divest the city of Los Angeles from Wells Fargo. From there, Measure B in 2018 garnered 44% of the vote to allow the city to create a public bank. And then in 2019, the statewide measure AB 857 passed, allowing municipalities to apply to create a public bank. Right now, we're in that process. And part of that process really is laying out what does this non-reformist reform of creating a publicly held financial piece of infrastructure that can direct funds to the causes, to the groups, to the borrowers through credit support activities. These are the same things that banks already are doing. They're just not doing them for everybody. And you need a public institution that can do it for everybody else. And that's really what this movement was born from and what this movement is about. And we're in a place that's really exciting in the movement of trying to develop that business plan, trying to submit it to the state, and lay out all the things that this bank should and could be doing, and really build that capacity and build that vision both within the broader public as well as within public officials. And I think it's super exciting as an institution, and really empowering in terms of what could be possible with such an institution. Thank you, Emily.
Great, thank you. Really appreciate that. wondering if Mo is here yet? No? Okay.
No.
All right. Then let's skip to Lydia. Lydia Lopez also serves on the board of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, and she joined the California CLT Community Land Trust Network in February of 2022 as co-director for organizing and partnerships. She has supported access to affordable housing and civil rights through her work with San Francisco tenants and home buyers, and through work with asylum seekers from around the world. Lydia has participated in Flores settlement monitoring detention centers at the US-Mexico border and documented conditions at private for-profit detention centers. So welcome, Lydia. Thank you so much. The floor is yours, and I'm going to set the timer.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for having me. I really love the theme of this event. I find myself constantly questioning why we keep doing things the same way. I like to continue asking why we don't respond more meaningfully to our community's needs. And we should all continue deconstructing all these social constructs to follow on Naveen's thread. And when it comes to housing, the community land trust model is in the process of slowly but steadily decolonizing the landscape of affordable housing. This idea that land is to be grabbed and hoarded to the detriment of our neighbors, in total disregard to our community's basic needs for housing. As community land trusts, we're going back instead to the concept of community ownership, which can seem a little daunting concept in our society, where this basic resource has become a for-profit vehicle for unscrupulous investors. We do this by splitting the land ownership from ownership of the buildings, creating deep affordability with this legal structure, and using the land as a community resource. With the community land trust model, community members decide what happens to the land and to their buildings, and they decide how to design their neighborhood according to their needs and their wants. They participate at the community land trust board level with a requirement that at least 1/3 of the members are current CLT residents who help steer the land on which the buildings are sitting. Hence the groundbreaking reform by reverting to community-owned resources, which may seem hard to grapple initially, but if we're becoming more in touch with the way a lot of indigenous groups look up to the land to ground us, to heal us, and to provide an essential non-commodifiable respite for physical and emotional health, it's not such a strange concept. As CLTs continue evolving and moving through this momentum, where a lot of creative collaborations are sprouting with city and county government, with repatriating the land, collaborations with developers, and hopefully soon collaborations with public and commercial banks. This resource can help provide all of the above. Plus, it can also provide a means of subsistence to our communities that can include urban farming, entrepreneur spaces for community members, nonprofit or community hubs providing critical community services and art spaces. I'd also like to congratulate the Xcamu Humboldt CLT on all its recent successes. We look up to our partners along with over 30 other community land trusts across California who are our network members. They do this amazing work and they inspire us every day as we look for more ways to support their work through our policy advocacy at the state level and regionally, through our growing curriculum, and through technical assistance that we provide to our network members who are interested in pursuing this work. And as we continue promoting the community land trust model as a viable alternative of affordable housing, I really look forward to continue collaborating in all these concentric circles that overlap critical next steps between community land trusts, public banks, co-ops, and grassroots organizing. This work is really not possible without the support of all our stakeholders. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Lydia. That was great. Yeah, I would like to next invite Ingrid Haftel. Ingrid is also on the board of the USN, so super happy to have all of you participate in this panel. She's a staff member at the Participatory Budgeting Project, where she manages democracy beyond elections. Before joining the Democracy Beyond Elections team, she oversaw community education programs at the Center for Urban Pedagogy and direct cultural organizing campaigns at People's Climate Movement. Her other past lives include being a curator at an architecture foundation, a mender and shelver of library books, and a pizza slinger. So welcome, Ingrid. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Emily. Good morning, good afternoon, folks. I'm delighted to be here. So at the Participatory Budgeting Project, our mission is to really transform democracy by centering community power. And the way that we do that is by helping people advocate for and implement participatory democracy practices in their own communities. And participatory budgeting is a participatory democracy practice where, in its most simple form, people come together to decide how to spend money. And as we advocate for it, PB, I'll use PB, shorten participatory budgeting to PB, it's not a tool for consulting the public on budgeting decisions. It is a process where community members have direct power in a decision-making process that has material outcomes. So in the process, as we advocate for it, people come together to design and write the rules of the process. They brainstorm ideas together, they develop proposals, vote on winning projects, and then those projects get implemented. And I think it's important to note that from the very beginning, PB needs to be designed by community members. And I think that's where we get into some of the differences between PB as a pure reform and PB as a potentially non-reformist reform. So for 14 years as an organization, we've supported PB processes in cities, towns, schools, school districts, housing developments, and organizations across North America. But PB really originated in Porto Alegre, Brazil in the 1980s with the Brazilian Workers' Party. And there, you know, the impacts are clear. And I don't think they're going to be surprising to folks in this room, but in communities where PB was implemented over a 10-year period, there was a drop of between 5 to 10% in infant mortality. That's a really impressive statistic, but I think we all know there's no real magic behind it. Letting those who are impacted by budgeting and policy decisions have a direct say in them means that the resources are going to go where they're needed. And I think in this way, the philosophy of PB is very closely related to the other non-reformist reforms we're hearing about today and other ones like universal basic income. I think, you know, in some ways, it's clear how PB can be a reformist reform, right? It's trying to remedy a public governance practice that is often done behind closed doors. And I think there are plenty of examples where PB works with, you know, well within the logic of capitalism. And we see this in places where the rules of the PB process, what's up for grabs, are already narrow and tightly defined. And PB becomes a way of like unleashing, you know, the wisdom of the people to make more efficient investments, right? Like that can happen with it. You know, like which streets should get their potholes filled first, right? These kind of trivial, non-essential questions. And I think we also see how without real engaged outreach to create a radically inclusive process, you know, business as usual will absolutely prevail. But as a non-reformist reform, I think there are lots of ways that PB can really help us practice and start to imagine a world beyond capitalism. And part of it is importantly, you know, this happens outside of elections and is necessarily more inclusive than elections. So people who are actively excluded right now from our electoral system are usually overrepresented in PB, and that can include Black people, Indigenous folks, poor people, working class people, youth, young people. So these people are actually overrepresented in PB, whereas, as we know, are actively excluded from our electoral system. And then another piece, I was doing a little reading. David Cobb, I figured you would appreciate some study of non-reformist reforms after the invitation came. So I did a little study. And I came across an article by Amna Akbar, who I believe is a legal scholar at Ohio State, who's written about Andre Gores, who I think is credited with kind of coining the term non-reformist reforms. And she writes, non-reformist reforms are not in themselves about finding an answer to a policy problem. They are centrally an exercise of power by people over the conditions of their own lives. And Gores, I think she's responding to Gores writing there that non-reformist reforms are experiment in the possibility of our own emancipation. So with deep ties and connections to what Lydia and Naveen said, these are experiments in unlearning the social constructs of colonialism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy. And we see this radical imagination happening with PB in places like Seattle, where folks have paired a demand with PB with a demand for divestment from policing. We also see it just in the radical possibility of practicing new ways of deciding together, which I think is a practice that is pivotally important as we start to build and live into a solidarity economy. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ingrid. I think that since we are missing Mo from the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, I will say a little bit about co-ops. So like I said, my day job is I'm the co-director of Wellspring Cooperative. A little bit about our organization. We started up just as a conversation maybe 13 years ago or so. And one of the reasons why we were exploring doing cooperative development in Springfield, which is in Western Massachusetts, about an hour and a half, 2 hours west of Boston, is because the valley that we're in, which is called the Pioneer Valley, which are the 3 counties that the Connecticut River runs through in Massachusetts. These 3 counties are incredibly co-op rich, worker co-op rich, as well as other kinds of co-ops, but particularly worker co-op rich. And I bet, given that it's a relatively rural area, that I see, Mo's trying to get in and is still having technical difficulties.
Emily, this is David. You keep going and I'll troubleshoot with Mel.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so very co-op rich. Yeah, on a per capita basis, I bet it's one of the most co-op dense areas in the entire country. Almost all of those co-ops are in the Upper Valley, which is where there are 5 colleges and UMass. The culture is quite different, very progressive, relatively homogeneous, white, well-educated, relative to the Lower Valley, which is where the big, well, out in Western Mass, where the cities are, Springfield, Holyoke, Chicopee, etc. Concentrated areas of communities of color, immigrants, also high unemployment, poverty, typical deindustrialized city kind of context. And so we believe, and this is entirely in keeping with the principles, the multiple principles of solidarity economy, if cooperatives are all that great, they need also to be relevant in struggling communities and not just in more privileged, affluent communities like the Upper Valley. So that's the work that we've been doing. We intentionally set out to create a network of mutually supportive co-ops. We now have 10 co-ops in our network, including a greenhouse, cleaning, mental health, outdoor excursions, and others. But so I'm going to go from there to talk a little bit about what's going on a broader level. So this is a moment where worker co-ops are really booming. There's a lot of interest. There's a lot of new co-op startups that have popped up all around the country. It's a movement as people's faith in capitalism and business as usual is shaken. People are looking for other models, and worker cooperatives are really capturing people's imagination as an opportunity to build something that is inherently not capitalist. It is not capitalist at the very least because it does not have the capitalist class divide of an owner and worker. In a worker co-op, the workers are the owners. So in that sense, structurally and inherently, it is not a capitalist enterprise. It means you're, hopefully, if all is working well, workers have that economic, democratic decision-making power. They are able to share in the profits and build wealth as the business grows. Co-ops, if you compare it to conventional businesses, do quite well in terms of benefiting workers, wages, job security, job satisfaction, tends to be good for the community, that dollars circulate more in the local community because they tend to spend and source locally. It tends to be a good business practice. Cooperative businesses have better longevity outcomes than conventional capitalist businesses. And they also are another way that they're good for communities is that it actually has been shown that worker co-ops boost civic participation because workers are engaging in that kind of democratic decision-making every day, and it tends to spill out into their lives. The last thing I'll say is not only are there many more co-ops popping up, there's a lot of investment in terms of policies on city and statewide levels, some federal. Many cities are investing millions and millions of dollars into supporting the development of worker co-ops. Foundations are more interested, and while co-ops we would consider as a really important backbone of the solidarity economy and inherently part of building a post-capitalist world. I'll stop there.
And Emily, I'm going to just, as a disembodied voice, share the good news that Mo is with us now.
Okay, welcome, Mo. Sorry. Yeah, I just did a little spiel on worker co-ops. We're heading into a conversation round, and I have a few framing questions that you all are invited to speak to. And the first one is, so you've all talked about ways in which your area of work is helping to build a solidarity economy. And now I want to ask you to reflect on ways that your work intersects both in theory and in actual practice, if you have some examples, with other aspects of the solidarity economy. So we're trying to pull these pieces together and connect them up so that it articulates a system and not just a whole bunch of atomized, isolated good practices. So maybe if it's okay, we'll take the same order. And Naveen, you would go first.
Sorry, my internet cut out for a moment. I think, Emily, the question was how to kind of thread things together in terms of the different moments in these movements, and to build both solidarity in the movements, but also solidarity into a future vision. Is that kind of right?
I think so. Like, how does your work intersect with other aspects of the solidarity economy, right? And if there are some, both kind of paint a big picture if you want, but also if you have any specific examples, like we're working with X, Y, and Z, blah, 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 blah. That makes sense?
Certainly.
Okay, great.
You know, I think it was funny when Ingrid was presenting and she used the acronym PB. That's also the acronym for Public Bank. PBLA is the same. And participatory budgeting and public banking are very much about creating public control over public finance. Specifically, Michael Brennan from the Democracy Collaborative had released a paper about 2 years ago on what a governance structure for the public bank.
Uh-oh. Technical problem, it looks like. Is everybody else seeing Naveen? Is
Structure in the 99 from.
Sorry, Naveen, I think you were just frozen. You might want to back up just a little bit. Sorry. And
Yes,
maybe
frozen again, Emily.
frozen again. Okay. Maybe we'll circle back to Naveen. And yeah, Mo, are you interested in weighing in on this round of
Sure.
how does the work that you do intersect with other aspects of the solidarity economy?
Thanks so much, Emily. I apologize for my lateness, but thank you for that really wonderful overview of worker co-ops in my stead. That was perfect and threads really nicely with, I think, this question and where we're going. So, you know, I'll continue to build off what Naveen had started to say is that, you know, and thank you. Also, thanks to Naveen for shouting out Michael Brennan, who is actually on the Federation staff now. And we talk a lot about the overlap between worker co-ops, co-ops in general, and the idea of public banks, because the development of public banks is one of the ways that I think co-ops can be bolstered and intertwined with kind of like this vision of a solidarity economy that we want to see. You know, Naveen spoke about, you know, the like governance structures of how public banks can work with having the input of the community is so necessary to create the transparency and accountability that we need in order to make sure that local economies have control over their money. Naveen, I see that you're back. So I wonder if you want to keep adding to what you're saying. I was kind of following your lead on the public banks and talking about how co-ops and public banks work together.
Can folks hear me? Okay, I switched to my phone, so hopefully there aren't connectivity issues. Thank you, Mo. I think that like public banking in general is an infrastructural play. It's around creating a decision-making framework similar to worker co-ops at an infrastructural level across the economy, and same thing similar to participatory budgeting, where you have a kind of framework that exists across specifically municipal finance. I think that there's an opportunity to be to ground it in a number of different ways. You can ground it in social causes. You can ground it in worker movements. I think of it really as a platform, and you can go with it in different directions to specific causes like affordable housing and credit enhancements for borrowers, like community land trusts, and you can talk very specifically about how these movements should incorporate such a premise into their platform. I'm hoping you can still hear me because now I'm getting warned that my internet connection is again unstable. So I think of it like that as a platform play. And then I'll also just point out two precedents for public banks. One is Sparkhausen in Germany, which is tied to something like 80% of small businesses in Germany. It's a network of small businesses, a network of small banks that supports a lot of the manufacturing sector throughout Germany. You're talking about close to 400 banks, and they're all publicly owned and publicly governed. And that has been a huge powerhouse for manufacturing, but also for public ownership within businesses. And another point that I'll draw attention to is in the same vein of concrete examples is the Bank of North Dakota, guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the state of North Dakota, not the federal government, and able to make loans for small businesses, they make student loans at non-predatory rates. They help folks buy homes. And again, it's the state, it's an arm of the state intervening to offer the same kind of lending products that don't often exist or don't exist at the scale that they need to. So yeah, I'll end with that.
Great, thank you, Naveen. Mo, did you want to elaborate any more? Yeah.
Yes, I'll keep going. So it's interesting that you're kind of talking about public banks as a tool or as a platform. I usually refer to worker co-ops as a tool in a tool belt, and I think those things go together. You know, the worker co-ops are such an important way for keeping money within communities, right, and circulating that. And I think in a lot of ways, public banks are the exact same way. And it creates a local stability that I think doesn't really exist in other ways. I know that worker co-ops, and I also know that public banks, you know, tend to survive in greater rates in times of economic hardship because it is so tied to the local, to the people who don't have access and need the access, especially in times of strife. You know, a lot of the trouble that worker co-ops run into when they're running into financing has a lot to do with financing, being able to have access to money. I know Emily mentioned earlier that there are like so many initiatives and a lot of money being poured into worker co-ops, and you know, one of the ways that one of the big stumbling blocks that still exist for worker co-ops is a good understanding of how they work, right? So a lot of financing really kind of has to deal with this like hierarchical structure of businesses having one or two people at the top and a lot of people on the front lines at the bottom. And the worker co-op structure in particular is much more broad-based, and you know, banks just don't understand it generally, by and large. We run into issues for getting like collateral requirements, personal guarantees, and I think public banks, because they are kind of like already have the mentality of accountability, of co-governance, that they're able to be responsive to the needs of co-ops. And I know that I've been, you know, tracking the public bank movements across the country and like seeing how they are always working in solidarity with the co-op movement. You know, I live in Philadelphia and we work very closely with the Public Banking Coalition. So I think that there is, you know, in order for one to exist, it is so important and needed to have the other to be supporting it. And there are a lot of overlaps, but I'll stop and let others weigh in as well here.
Lydia, you want to weigh in?
Thank you. Yeah, just as co-ops are the backbone of the Solidarity Economy Network, and I'm a huge fan of co-ops. My grandfather helped to found a co-op in Kikaker, Belize for lobster fishing, and it completely transformed the lives of everyone in Belize. It became a national co-op and essentially getting rid of all the middlemen, taking those profits from the community. But co-ops are also the backbone of a lot of our community land trust projects. The co-op model, like the CLT model, has the potential of reimagining housing as a resource with deep affordability for our community members. A lot of our CLT projects include limited equity housing co-ops, and some critics frown at the concept of limited equity in this equation, but if we look at how much families and individuals are sinking into high rents, a person could easily sink $250,000 in rent in less than 10 years in any city in the US, essentially walking away at the end of that tenancy with zero equity. And so when we look at it through this lens, that limited equity is something that heirs can inherit. It can be a vehicle for multi-generational wealth. It can become seed money for purchasing a home at market rate. It can support a college education or a person in their retirement. And with regards to our policy efforts, the more we collectively band together in pushing policies at the local, regional, and state levels, the louder we can be collectively, the more we can advance these policies that also advance solidarity economy and community ownership. And we hope to move in the direction where more lending products are made available for community projects, because as a matter of course, these community projects have not been prioritized. Instead, we see in our communities a lot of luxury apartments getting built, even while we're walking through encampments of homeless in all our cities and all our neighborhoods. So as a network, we're getting ready to organize a lenders circle where we do some education about the possibilities and about the products that are needed, because essentially a lot of these CLT projects are not more risky than other mortgages out there. And so it's really just educating the stakeholders so that they understand the model, and really this split of the land and the housing. It can be a trippy concept for some of them, but as a market product, is not a more risky venture than other mortgages. So it makes me very happy to hear about participatory democracy, because only with our community members deciding how the funds are allocated to community projects, we can really see a shift in the landscape of housing.
Lydia, I was wondering if you could just really quickly define limited equity for folks who might not be familiar with that term.
Which term?
Limited equity.
Yes, of course. With a limited equity housing co-op, there's an affordability restriction built into the ground lease. And so there's a community land trust that holds ownership of the land on behalf of the community. The community members participate at the board level, deciding how the land is stewarded as affordable in perpetuity. And there could be a co-op, limited equity housing co-op sitting on top of that land. And through the use of legal instruments, there's affordability restrictions so that persons with certain income limits can access that housing. And when a person decides to sell their share in the co-op, they get back limited equity, because the affordability is built into that legal structure. And so there's an algorithm that calculates. It depends on the city, it depends on the price of housing, but there's always a cap to that limited equity, because it's meant to be affordable housing, and it's meant to have welfare exemptions in the tax code. And so some of our policies at the state level have to do with getting more fair treatment to community land trusts, given that there's this affordability restriction, and these homes are never going to be sold at market rate. They're a community resource.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Perfect. Ingrid, you want to hop in?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, one thread I will pick up is reflecting on, I heard Mo speak of co-ops as tools, and Naveen talk about public banks as platforms. PB, at its heart, is really a process, a governance process. And of course, like the principles and values that guide that process matter. And within our organization, we really center equity and racial equity, in particular, accessibility and significance, but also like direct ties for the principles of the solidarity economy to really like lead in how that process is implemented. And I think like personally, and as an organization, we often reflect on how we have so much to learn from co-ops, collectives, and people who have been practicing collective decision-making for eons. And I think, here on Turtle Island, and under the theme of decolonizing economics, we know that the Iroquois Confederacy centered participation and peace like in their governance. And it's also an uncredited influence in our own form of democracy in the US. So I think like that theme of like a process and structure for governance is one way that we have like deep ties to other non-reformist reforms. And, we can all practice PB, our own flavor and form of it. We do it at PBP. We have an internal participatory budgeting process. Lots of other organizations are doing it. And we're seeing, other organizations and formations in the absence of like a state-sponsored PB process, right? A city-sponsored PB process saying, okay, you're not going to do it, we'll do it. And so we're seeing that, for instance, the African American Roundtable in Milwaukee right now has been asking for a racial justice-centered PB process for a long time. The city's not doing it. And so they're saying, okay, we're going to do it. We're going to do our own PB process and let the people decide.
Great, thank you. That's very wonderful and very rich. And I want to, before we open up to comments and questions from participants, and so I would like to invite people to put questions in the chat. We'll turn to that in a second. I have two more things. I'm going to combine them and ask you to do one more round addressing the following two things. The first one is what's really challenging and maybe what's really exciting or promising. So both the challenge and the promise. And also if you can say a little bit about how you speak to folks who are saying, oh, there's just no alternative to capitalism. It's just here to stay. It's too entrenched in our, in our realities, in our systems. We really cannot move beyond capitalism. What do you say? So those are the two things. Maybe we'll go in reverse order. Does that make sense? Ingrid, are you willing to start? So it would be Ingrid, Lydia, Mo, Naveen.
Sure. Okay. So I'm hearing challenges, hope, and like, how do we, what's our answer for this? This just isn't possible, right? Capitalism is what we got.
How do you speak to the Tina syndrome, right? There is no alternative.
Yes. Yeah. So first on the challenges, I think, I'm seeing some fabulous questions in the chat pop up that like get right to the heart with participatory budgeting in particular. I am seeing some, comments on like the significance of the budgets, right? Like, what if these are just like little trifling bits of money? What does that matter? And I think we see that as a barrier for sure, particularly when that, undermines trust in the process. So that's something we're always alive to, and encouraging folks to really center the significance of the budget. And that doesn't have to mean, one thing I like to reflect on is that doesn't have to mean like the biggest budget, right? Depending on the scale and size of the communities, depending on our organizations, what matters is that it's significant and we can come together and share power over that. But one process that's giving me hope is the process in Seattle, where that is a hard-fought participatory budgeting process that came directly out of the murder of George Floyd by police. It builds on a long history of Black-centered organizing in Seattle against community divestment and anti-Black racism. And that process actually won a $12 million divestment from the Seattle Police Department with a match from the City Council. And I think one of the most incredible pieces is it's not just about like taking a cookie cutter PB process, like taking a toolkit and doing it. Organizers also won $3 million for a Black-led community research project, paid participatory action research to actually like shape the process, right? So that community members who are most impacted by policing are centered in the process. And that process is underway right now. It's been super contentious. I think there are folks who would like everyone to forget that this is actually an example of divestment, but there are also organizers who have been doing this work for decades who aren't going to let anyone forget that that's the roots of this process. So that's one particular case study that's giving me hope. I also saw some amazing stuff in the chat about things happening with like American Rescue Plan money, right? Federal money that, people are actually like contesting how it gets spent. In terms of like Tina and like, there's no outside. The one thing like I am experiencing personally, and this is not going to be news to anyone, but like we all know how much energy it takes to maintain the current system and how much violence it's doing to all of us. So that is just like, if that's our starting place, then like, please, let's just figure out something else together. Because, and I think, that's a comment that often comes up with PB where it's like, this takes a lot of time. You need implementation resources. You need to pay people to participate. Like what? And it's like, well, just think about how much money and time and energy is going into the current system. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Ingrid. Lydia?
Thank you, Emily. As far as what keeps me hopeful in light of many challenges around us, I'm always inspired with our collective wins. Through our policy work, we were able to push for a policy called FIP, Foreclosure Intervention Housing Preservation Program, which allocated $500 million in California to preserve housing in the process of foreclosure. And this policy essentially gives the current owner or a nonprofit first dibs on that property. And a lot of our work this year will be focused on getting our network members ready to be able to access the FIP funding once it becomes available sometime in the fall. We've also had other wins at the policy level, and I think connecting with our network members, connecting with all the other organizations doing solidarity work, it's always a huge inspiration for me personally. And the people doing this work also give me a lot of hope. David Cobb connecting us, some of us, through all these concentric circles of collaboration and inspiration. And just really looking forward to connecting more with everyone that is doing a lot of this collaborative work, solidarity work, and finding ways how we can collaborate and make more connections among all the different work.
Great, thanks, Lydia. Let's see, Mo.
I was just kind of soaking in Lydia's words a little bit. I right on, very much the same. I think what brings me hope is rooms like this, rooms like ones that I've been privileged to sit in, like the Alliance for a Just Philadelphia, which is a group, honestly, like sort of a group similar to this, right? So it's in Philadelphia, it's a coalition of, I want to say, I think about 40 organizations right now, all grassroots, that represent the people who are the most locked out of resources in the city. And they actually pulled in the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance that I also do some work with into that group to make sure that cooperative values and participatory decision-making is very much alive in all of the work that they do. So like learning, how do we make these decisions together? How do we move as one, even though we are working towards different goals? That is just like wildly inspiring to me, going from, that's helped move us from having a city council where we had no support to now a city council in Philadelphia where we have a cohort of city councilors that do centralize the needs of the community organizations that they came out of, right? So people that were organizers that are now actually sitting in city council, like Kendra Brooks. It's really amazing to see that. I also get a lot of hope out of things like at the end of last year, Congress passed the Work Act, which led to $50 million towards employee ownership. And that's important because it's not just, this money could be for whatever, but it's specifically for education and outreach regarding financial education, open book management, and seeking greater worker input. That kind of stuff, like making sure that that's actually ingrained if we're talking about like operating in the gap between where we are and where the vision of the future that we want to see. Like those are the things that are going to get us there. So those are the things that I think really make me hopeful. And when people say to me, capitalism is too ingrained, first of all, I'm like, America's not that old. Look at the history of the world. And people thought America was impossible. And I don't like where we're sitting right now as America, but that's huge. And I also pull up my mind-blowing statistic that I found over the course of my work, which is that on average, CEOs in the US make 351 times as much as a typical third lowest paid worker, like the gap between the highest paid worker and lowest paid worker. The average is 351 to 1. Who is okay with that? I do not, and I have yet to find a person who is okay with this once they are confronted with that issue. So so those are just a few of the things that keep me hopeful and charged up.
Great. Thank you, Mo. Naveen, want to weigh in?
Sure. This has been super stimulating, and I especially appreciate the point that Mo just made in terms of who is okay with that. I honestly think that, just to start from that point, a lot of the structures that are in place, including our public officials are okay with that. Our public officials think that system works. And to answer, Emily, your question around what are the challenges, the biggest challenge that I think the public banking movement faces is LA has had a few very high profile corruption cases among city council members and supervisors in the past 3 years. But the city is not, in my opinion, especially corrupt. It's just more incompetent, especially when you look at an issue like homelessness. There's 6 different local agencies that all govern homelessness, and every city council district of the 15 kind of pushes the buck between them in terms of committing to building. So when you look at something like a more complicated and nuanced issue, like creating a public financial institution, city officials say that that's not their job. Debt managers for the city say that, frankly, we would fuck it up. Pardon my language, but that's literally what the city's debt manager has said. We don't want to endanger our credit rating. So building competency and confidence within our public officials, particularly in LA, but I know that this is a unique place and a unique position, is a huge hurdle. It's honestly less one of public perception. It's more one of inertia among public officials, and it goes all the way to the top. Like the Federal Reserve has dragged their feet on issuing a charter, issuing membership to the American Bank of Samoa, which was formed in 2016. It's been 7 years. But getting them a charter is not something that the Federal Reserve is interested in doing because they don't support public bank institutions. They don't support publicly controlled banking institutions other than through shareholders. Similarly with the FDIC, I saw a question in the chat about chartering a bank. This bank would have to be chartered by and insured by the FDIC, be chartered by the state through probably the DBO, the Department of Business Oversight, and then insured by the FDIC. The FDIC has said they won't insure a public financial institution. There's workarounds, and you can structure things to get yourself to a point of greater public control over finances. But the lack of faith that our public officials have in themselves is kind of staggering. So that's, I think, a big hurdle. And I think it also speaks to, Emily, your question of how to move beyond capitalism. And I think that ultimately, that's where the non-reformist reform sits, right? It's it's in the in-between space. A public financial institution, a public bank, would have to be ultimately, within a couple of years, profitable. It's not going to be able to say, just keep giving us money and we'll do good things with it. You have to find a way within existing profit-seeking behavior to do more of the things that need to be done. In a way, and it's totally doable. It's not a constraint insofar as you can still do it, but it doesn't challenge the current structure of money, power, and land. In essence, you're kind of nibbling around the edges at racial capitalism, even with a publicly held financial institution. What does it look like beyond? It's hard for me to tell, but the moments of hope, the kind of hopeful and exciting pieces that have come up lately, specifically in LA, there's Measure ULA, which will generate United to House LA. It's a tax measure of 5%, 4% on transactions over real estate transactions over $5 million, and 4% over $5 million, and 5% over $10 million. It's called the mansion tax, but it also affects like large office buildings, commercial real estate. Supposed to generate close to $1 billion as a sustaining financial source for housing. And there is a 10% slug of that that's supposed to support unconventional financing sources. I think that the money, the problem that in such a measure is still that it's spend it. It's like you get the money and then you spend it. There's not a way to sustain the money, which is what a public financial institution would be able to do. You use banking measures to kind of multiply what that money can do rather than just spending it once. But that's still very hopeful and fundamentally can change the power structure within the real estate sector to create more power for community land trusts, for borrowers who have limited access to credit, specifically in housing. Another thing that United Way was a sponsor of that measure. Another thing that they're doing is they put together a couple $100 million debt fund, also for community land trusts through private philanthropic capital. And it's debt fund, which means that the money doesn't get spent once, it gets lent. And you can use that as a way, as a private sector vehicle, and all the private equity and big banks do this already, but there's very few folks who are doing it for the public good at that same scale. And that gives me some hope, especially when you compare that to kind of inertia among public officials. If you can do it in the private sector, then you can kind of, it does become a non-reformist reform. I think if you do it right, and an organization like United Way is poised to do that. And then another thing would be the Inflation Reduction Act, including $30 billion earmarked for green banks. It kind of is TBD on whether that becomes just a reformist reform or a non-reformist reform, because it's the devil's in the details on that. But that money could be used to do small business loans for alternative energy companies. It probably will be used for like energy rebates, which is, it could be impactful, it could not be. But the idea that public ownership over public finances was built into a piece of the Inflation Reduction Act, I think was also powerful. And all of that gives me hope.
Thank you, Naveen. That's great. Thank you all for your good thoughts and sharing and experience and wisdom. We're going to turn now to the comments and the questions from the chat. So I just do want to point people to the chat. It's very rich. There's lots of comments and there are resources. There was a question, will people have access to the chat? So that's a question for the tech support, I think. Is there an answer to that? Will people be able to have that? I think we're waiting for an answer, but I do recommend that you take a look at that. So there
I'm
are
just going to jump in as tech support and say you can save the chat yourself by clicking the bottom 3 ellipses on the bottom right of the Zoom account. We will be making video recording available of this and all of the sessions, but I don't know if we have the capacity to save the chat, coordinate it with others. So this is one of those situations where I think that we're going to have to ask that folks do that. And if you're on a cell phone, I apologize, but I don't think that we have the capacity to do that for you. Okay, thank you, David. So there are a bunch of questions that are specifically for individuals. So I'm going to start with that, and then there are a couple questions that I see that you could all speak. I'm going to just say what they are so you can have a think about it. One is where are the gaps in solidarity economy? And 2 is how do we do this work with so much trauma coming from a number of different many different sources. So gaps in SE and trauma in our work. How does that show up? How do we deal with it? So you can think about that, but the questions to individuals, starting with Naveen, there were 2 questions.
So there was a question, maybe it's a clarification, and if you can kind of try to keep your answers brief so that we have time for those general questions. So maybe it's a clarification. Somebody asked, shouldn't we have public banks instead of public banks that are just supplements to private banks? That's one. And then another one was asking, can you give some examples? You mentioned that there's like a powerhouse impact. I think you named some, but somebody was asking for a little bit more elaboration.
Sure. So first, I think the answer is that yes, the public bank should stand alone and be less of a supplement. I think specifically in California, public banks, the legislation that passed requires public banks to be a supplement to commercial banks in a frankly political way, just to avoid stepping on the toes of commercial banks. I think it can be a non-reformist reform in that way, but it's an incremental approach. In terms of powerhouse, I can kind of talk about it in the context specifically, for instance, of small businesses. In California, there's a iBank, the infrastructure bank. They guarantee loans to small businesses at a certain underwriting level. During the pandemic, they guaranteed 95% of a loan that met a certain underwriting standard. What underwriting standard means in this case was like, are you as a CDFI, a community development financial institution, and they do this through a financial development corporation, but basically they're a big bank that says, if you are a small bank that makes loans that are to a minority-owned business, to a business of 10 people or fewer, to a business that's owned by somebody who lives in one of these census tracts, we will guarantee 95% of that loan. They do that already, and that's exactly what a public bank can do, but more regionally and with more local ownership and local control, where you're able to expand the lending and expand credit availability to folks who generally don't have that access to credit. You can do the same thing with housing. And what you're doing is not like going out and originating new loans. What you're doing is supporting the institutions, the entities that already do, the CDFIs, the lending funds, by guaranteeing basically the first loss position. So if somebody's making a $1 million loan, the public bank is putting away $100,000 and saying, we think there's a less than 10% chance that this $1 million loan will go bad, and they therefore can use $1 million of their money to guarantee $10 million because they're taking the top 10% loss position on a pool of loans, and that creates a huge like expansive opportunity. You still have to have those other banks go out and get money from their sources, but you're de-risking it because you're a public financial institution able to own the biggest risk, the riskiest piece of debt. That's how that should work in theory.
Thank you, Naveen. Let's see, Lydia, there was a question on whether CLTs are taxed the same as private land.
Thank you. They are not taxed at the same rate. They're currently taxed at a lower rate to the extent that a CLT keeps affordable housing on the land. So they get a percentage tax break on that portion, and sometimes they get a welfare exemption, which means they pay no taxes for the portion that keeps affordable housing, which includes the affordability restrictions I referenced earlier. And right now we're actually pushing at the state level in California through an Assembly Bill 430 to clarify that CLTs are already an innovation, an innovative model of housing that doesn't only provide housing, but they provide community services as expressed by the community, as designed by the community. They provide business incubation spaces that host markets and other community amenities. And sometimes they include open spaces for recreation. And so we're pushing through this state bill, AB 430, to have the entire property be designated for welfare exemption, because this is already serving vulnerable communities that need those services. And that really need to also have other features besides the housing. And I see especially the business incubation spaces as a very important source of income where the community members can be their own agents in their income generation and not really be depending on these in California and in a lot of places this concept of minimum wage is just ridiculous because it doesn't align anywhere close to the cost of living in most locations. And so it's just meaningless at some point to talk about minimum wage because we're not doing enough to keep minimum wage on par with the cost of living in our locations.
Thank you, Lydia. Ingrid, you had a couple questions about who tends to participate. I'm sure there's a lot of variation, but who participates? And my guess is a lot of that was getting at, is it kind of a diverse representation that matches the diversity in the community? That's one. And then asking you to reflect on what somebody had heard, that there's a very high rate of failure of participatory budgeting projects, initiatives.
Indeed. Okay, so to the first question, I actually see like a rich conversation in the chat kind of talking about inclusion and exclusion in many of the like practices and reforms we're talking about. And I think, one thing that has something I've needed and need to continually like learn and center and think about is how things like participatory budgeting are necessarily iterative processes. Like these are things that have to happen over and over and over again, and we have to learn from that practice. And someone in the chat pointed out, anytime there's a line that's drawn, folks are left out, right? So it's not just one time asking who's included and who's excluded. It's that question becoming part of your practice over and over and over again. And I think like that is really hard, especially for the trauma of racialized capitalism. I saw that beautiful question about like, how do we do this? How do we take risks in the midst of that? And so, two things that come to mind to that is the importance of centering arts, culture, and care in all of these practices. Lydia, I heard you kind of lift up like spaces for recreation, thinking about how the work that we're doing can center on care. And that being part of the paradigm shift as well. And then also just practically moving resources in real ways to people when we can. So in participatory budgeting, the way we think about that is paying folks for their time, and not just contributions, right, or labor, but like for time and ideas and participation when we can. And I know that there are real repressive constraints around that in certain governments and places, so that's real. And then, yeah, in terms of the failure of participatory budgeting projects, I mean, yeah, it absolutely happens. And that could be because, folks who signed up to do PB in the first place didn't really understand like what was entailed, right? There might not have been that commitment to implementation. There are lots of issues that we have to like work through together, right? But again, I think that goes back to the iterative nature of this work. It can't just be about doing participatory budgeting once and figuring out whether it worked and whether you got the thing that you wanted built. It needs to become, just like all of these other non-reformist reforms, right, are about a spirit of experimentation, participation, radical inclusion, that these are things that we practice together in an ongoing way and don't use the logic of capitalism where what we put in produces the result or the profit that we want, right? We have to shift away from that. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, I love the point about the iterative process, that these are all processes. We never find perfection. We never find the end. We need to always be thinking about what are our values and principles and trying to improve in every single time we do that. So just something we have to keep in mind no matter what kind of work that we're doing. Okay, Mo, let's see, there was a question about, do you know how successful consumer cooperatives are compared to worker co-ops? Or can you just say anything comparing the two? You could throw in other kind of co-ops as well, producer if you want. Just maybe just start by, because maybe not everybody knows these main types, worker, producer, and consumer. Maybe start there. Just
Yeah,
so
yeah,
everybody's
thank
on the
you.
same page.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, so just the very broad strokes, how I quickly explain it is there's consumer co-ops that are like your food co-ops. It's where there's a lot of people are collectively owning a thing. So whether it's a grocery store or a credit.
Oh, hey Mo, you just muted somehow.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Perfect. Yeah.
So if you're, most people might be familiar with a food cooperative or a credit union, which I think, I don't know, success is very relative. So I think like the success of like of credit unions is that like so many people are part of them. The failure is that most people don't know that it's a cooperative structure, right? And participate in it in that way. Producer co-ops are when like people who are collectivizing something like a back end like marketing or distribution. So if you look at my favorite, Cabot Creamery, is a producer co-op of farms in the Vermont area, my main cheese. And worker co-ops are a structure where the people who work at the business own it. They did make all the decisions about how it works. So I find it hard to compare like is one more successful than the other. I mean, certainly, you know, worker co-ops are the smallest piece of the pie. That it's in comparatively to producer and consumer co-ops is very, very small slice of the pie, but it is the fastest, because of that, it's also the fastest growing as people are coming to understand it. So it's so I mean that I've so many other things that I want to say in response to what others said, but I'll stop there for the sake of time.
Okay, thanks. I did want to, there's one comment that I just wanted to clarify relative to my comments. So there was a question about Springfield being co-op rich. So I just want to be clear. Springfield is in the lower valley. Before Wellspring started working in the lower valley, there were virtually no co-ops at all. The upper valley is where the 5 colleges are, which is super co-op rich. So just clarification. Okay, so I want to do one final round, and y'all, we have 10 minutes left. Well, a little less than 10 minutes left. I want to do a round of all of you to talk. I'm just going to give you the topics. So one is gaps in the solidarity economy. And then, yeah, we're all carrying trauma, especially from capitalism. And then there was one more, if you feel, and Ingrid already spoke a bit to this, like who's left out specifically. There were questions around people with disabilities, which are often a kind of invisible group or population. Anyway, who's being left out, either in your work or just broadly? Who is in a marginalized or oppressed situation who we're not so aware of? Okay, so I'm going to go back to the original order of Naveen, Mo, Lydia, Ingrid. So maybe just like a minute or two.
Too many times today. Okay, brief. Gaps. It's a really great question, and I appreciate it being asked. I think especially something like public finance is inherently very esoteric. And in a similar vein to like participatory budgeting, I think people think that like it's not necessarily even their job to be involved. And I think there's a hurdle there. So like I think of it as like, how do you bring people along? And I think part of it is education, and part of it is fundamentally like who's showing up at a meeting. Like you have to have means, you have to have time. Like it is an inherently exclusive idea and concept, whether even once you have the institution, who's included. That's a really important question. I think sortition can kind of in an institutionalized way like help get around that. I think the other question that I was asked about trauma, and that is to say that I don't have a great answer in terms of the gaps. I think there are gaps. I think that that's part of the moment in time that we find ourselves in, and I think carrying the gaps with us is how you do better. And then the other question about trauma, I also, I guess it's good that I'm going first because I feel like I had poor answers for both of these. I think that trauma is inherent in a capitalist exploitative structure. I think that in the spirit of non-reformist reforms, something like reparative justice and reparations needs to be the framework that you use to it's like a trauma-informed approach, where you are taking a capitalist vein and a capitalist lens, but specifically focusing on the folks who are left out, of the solidarity economy, and specifically focused on the folks who have been carrying trauma as a result of the current system, and creating that structure to actually lift up those needs. I think that's how you start.
Thank you. Well,
yeah, I also have 5 answers to all of these things. It's to build up what Naveen said. I think, we have to, much as always happens, if no one else is going to do it, we have to do it. We have to show up more fully, and we have to understand both, where we are, the structures that exist, and also hold where we want to be. I think that, to speak to the trauma piece a little bit, I am seeing more and more organizations within this our kind of solidarity economy hemisphere looking at rest as a way to fight back against the capitalist systems, because capitalism will always be go, 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 do the most, make the most money, exploit the most people. But centering rest is the only way to, maybe not the only way, but it is such a great way to make sure that we are taking the time to pull ourselves out of the timelines that are being imposed upon us and creating our own timelines. I just read Rest as Resistance, which is a pretty short paper that probably you could find anywhere. But it really changed the way that I'm thinking about what I'm doing on my sabbatical. I thought, oh, sabbatical must be you go do a thing, right? But no, sabbatical could be, I'm going to be with my family. I'm going to be present in my life and understand why I'm doing the work that I do and getting the healing that I need in order to participate more fully in this work that's really grueling. It's really hard. And then one thing I did want to say is I wanted to shout out the group that put together Economics for Emancipation, because there was a little talk in the chat about how do we introduce these ideas, what are the gaps. I think Emily, you might have mentioned that, and one of those things is education that is accessible by the people who are trying to make change happen, right? You could go to Harvard or Yale and learn about economics, but that's not accessible. I have a college degree, it's not accessible to me. and I think the more that we are looking towards toolkits like this free, no-cost course called Economics for Emancipation that make transformative change accessible to people who are locked out of resources, that's really what we need. That's kind of the gap that I'm starting to see filled. So.
Thank you. Yeah, Lydia.
Thank you, Emily. Regarding doing this work and reflecting on the trauma and the collective trauma, I always like to go back to the inspiration that the work itself gives me, the inspiration that the people doing this work give me, and personally, I feel like doing this work is in itself healing, and I couldn't imagine doing any other type of work that didn't seek some sort of transformation and evolution in all our spaces. With regards to who's left out, which populations are not easily included in our democratic processes, in our participatory processes, I think it's very important how we do the outreach, where we do the outreach, who does the outreach. And I feel like a lot of the people we're trying to reach and include in our democratic processes are also coming from a place of trauma. And as Naveen mentioned, with other limitations of time, limitations of their schedules. And so a lot of populations easily, slip through the cracks that should be a part of the conversation. We just finished a landscape scan in the San Joaquin Valley. This is the Central Valley in California, where historically there's a lot of disinvestment in communities of color, where a lot of the communities are often not included in the political process, a place where a majority of the people of color are not part of the politics of the place, and the cities are run by conservative players that are invested in maintaining the status quo. And one of the things we did to do outreach to the populations we wanted to reach during this landscape scan, to talk about community ownership and figure out who's interested and who needs resources to get more invested in that area. We provided stipends to the participants so that they could come to the meetings. We held some meetings in person, and we try to make it as accessible as possible, but also not assuming that we can continue tapping a community for their know-how and their wisdom without compensating them in some way.
Thank you, Lydia. Ingrid?
This has been such an inspiring event to be a part of. So I just wanted to say that and send so much gratitude to my co-presenters and also the folks in the chat, folks who are participating. So thank you. And Emily for your leadership here too. So on the question of like exclusion, I don't think I need to say too much more because there've been some beautiful answers here already. But I mean, absolutely, there are huge gaps. In particular, I was thinking about, incarcerated people in PB, people who are like completely excluded from our governance processes, people with disabilities, also people who don't have connections to the institutions, and like groups who have already learned how to contest for power as a survival strategy, like don't have those like pathways. And there are some technical fixes to this. Sortition has come up. And I think technical fixes are good. Sortition is a way of soliciting participation in a way that you can kind of control or correct for underrepresentation. But I also think we necessarily have to go beyond technical fixes. In our work, we strive to center accessibility, and we recognize that as like a very short-term, insufficient aim, because we know we have to go beyond accessibility and learn learn lessons from language and disability justice, where we shift the lens from like adapting our processes to actually ceding control and power. We recognize we have a long way to go here. I also think it has deep connections to who we hire and include and pay in the work that we do in our own organizations. And then on the trauma piece, to Mo's point about rest, that really resonated with me. And I'll say again, I also think that bringing artists, cultural workers, and care workers into the work from the beginning, not to like make it look pretty or feel nice at the end. These are folks who think outside of the logic of capitalism all the time. And I think by centering them in our work, we'll get that much closer to where we need to be.
Beautiful. That's beautiful. So I did see, I think it was David said the actual hard stop is at 1:45. So I think what I'll do is wrap up this session, and then maybe if anybody, both the presenters and any other participants want to stay on till then, maybe we can have, there were so many questions and comments, and we didn't have time for everything. So I invite you to stay till 1:45. I want to close us out with a thought about hope. There was a question about, how do you, there's so much despair given these very scary times. And so first of all, I just hope that these examples of concrete solidarity economy initiatives and practices are a source of hope. I certainly know that in the popular economics work that I've done for decades through the Center for Popular Economics, like we do a really great job critiquing capitalism. We do a great job. And what we learned is that often people would finish our week-long immersion being really depressed. Because we didn't do as good a job talking about, well, what is the alternative? We would talk about abstract things like socialism, actually existing socialism, or we would do this pie in the sky visioning exercise. It was only when we started talking about solidarity economy, one which is a framework, which pulls together all these actually existing many old practices. Some are new, some are mainstream, some are alternative. It was only when we really started talking about solidarity economy that we could see the difference, like the combining the critique of capitalism with, yes, here are actually existing practices that are building towards an alternative system. So hopefully that's all a source of hope, engaging in, knowing about this kind of work. And I guess I just want to make a comment to the question about what's missing. To me, what's missing now is that question about really scaling up, which is not necessarily bigger. Sometimes we talk about scaling out. So this is a little shout out to Blair using that language, right? How do we connect up so that we can articulate a system? Because right now, even though we know each other, a lot of us recognize each other as engaged in the same project of building a solidarity economy and system change. Like, how do we scale that up, strengthen that so that we're really articulating a system as opposed to our individual practices? So today was a good start on that conversation. A lot of people talked about connections that are already in existence. With that, I want to thank our speakers. What a great panel. Thank you for your time and your wisdom and inspiring examples. So thank you. I invite people to stay on for a few more minutes if you want. But with that, we're going to officially wrap this workshop. So thank you. And if the presenters, if you want to just any last, 10-second words. Yeah, Naveen, you want to say something?
I was just going to say thank you for having us. This was humbling to be a part of and very stimulating as well.
Same. I could have kept this conversation going for another 3 hours.
Lydia, I see you're unmuted.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Thank you for having us. I'm just going to say one last bit. I feel like I really love all the comments on the chat. I haven't been able to read all of them, but I'm printing them, and it's really inspiring to see what all the participants are sharing. And I love that some of the comments go looking beyond income and looking at universal basic resources and assets for the community. And I want to continue here shamelessly plugging in the community land trust model because it lends itself to stewarding community resources for the community. And it lends itself to the community having participatory democratic decision making and removing assets away from the profit-seeking model and into a space of collaboration and radical inclusion where the community is collectively designing what they want and what they need in their communities. Great. So definitely radical inclusion is key for a lot of our work, and thank you.
Thank you. Ingrid, I'll give you a second if you want. Oh, you're muted.
I'll echo all of the gratitude to the conveners, Emily, David, for bringing us together. I'll also say Eid Mubarak for anyone who is celebrating, because I'm about to go celebrate with my fam. So,
okay, so we are officially wrapped. But if I don't know who of the panelists can stay on till quarter of, another less than 10 minutes. Yeah. With that, can we just open it up to everybody? There's way too many questions for me to field. So I guess
so I'll just to say, Emily, this is David. I'm not sure, like, you've only got a few minutes before we have to shut this off. So
yep.
Are you asking us to just turn on everybody's mic? I think we can do that. If I'm not sure what you're asking of us.
That's what I was asking, but we don't have to do that either way. I'm just looking for, there were so many questions. I totally got overwhelmed.
Can I just make a friendly suggestion? If the other panelists, if you captured anything in the chat that you really want to speak to, maybe that would be the best use of like 7 minutes.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So super short round, super. Anybody want to jump in? Did you see anything in the chat that we didn't already talk about? Value time and
I'm still scanning through there, but I see that some folks want to know more about community land trust. So I'm gonna share my contact there on the chat, as well as I saw that someone shared our website as well. Thank you for doing that.
Perfect. Great. Anybody else? Did you see anything that you feel moved to answer?
Well, I will say I saw a lot of calls for us just finding ways to continue this conversation. And I don't know, maybe this is like volunteering David to help us figure out how can we do that? Like, is there like a listserv or just like a part 2 to this discussion? Because there's so much wisdom that was in the chat that I want to like bring into here. But I think one thing that we hit on that I want to kind of go back to is just that like failure is going to happen and it's okay. Like we hold ourselves to these like ridiculous standards that they're just impossible, and it prevents us from really tapping into like the fullness of our humanity if we have these expectations that are completely unattainable. So I just want to go back to like the rest and taking care of each other, because no one else is going to do it if we don't do it. And I'm just struck. I'm really grateful for this kind of configuration of panelists, because just like the idea of that, just like we own our money together, we own our land together, we own our businesses together, we make our decisions together. We have to do this together. Like these are not things that are moving in silos. We have to do them together, or else we'll not be able to succeed on our own. We have to combine our forces.
Thank you. That's great. Naveen or Ingrid, did you pick up anything from the chat that you feel moved to speak to? Or anything else?
Just on Mo's point about like working together, I saw it looks like the like conflict transformation piece, just holding that as something. It seems like, I can't remember, is it who's holding a workshop on that I saw? Maybe we could post that again. I might have missed that, but just the importance of creating space for like building up those skills together. I feel like it probably touches on each of the issues that we talked about, that transforming a relationship to conflict and like failure is absolutely at the center of continuing to work together and doing the work we need to do.
Amen. Naveen?
Sure. I think just to pick up on what's been said already is that from us, like these convenings and building solidarity among the folks who are already doing a lot of this work, and not just the folks who have spoken today, but the folks who are in the chat and the folks who are in the audience. Like, I think that creating those nodes of overlap is super powerful. And I wanted to pick up on a point I think PG in the chat had made, or I don't know, like an hour ago, on like, the comment was, after a 3-day conference on this, the California public bank activist said, after this conference, I feel like what we have been doing is trivial. Where do you see public banking as compared to public money? The infinity sign standing behind depository institutions is something that I kind of touched on earlier, in that our government has a lot more faith in private institutions than it does in public, which is odd for a public institution. But I think in response to that, I think thinking through solidarity movements in general is how you start to disentangle some of that, by framing how all of these movements are connected and how working together creates a more powerful, and to quote David Cobb, actually, to use solidarity to get to an ultimate vision, and to think about your vision and think about solidarity as part of the strategy to get there. I think that becomes really powerful, and I applaud this group for bringing the conversation together, and especially Emily and David for kind of seeing that power that comes from that unity.
So I'm going to jump in, and I gotta say, y'all, I was literally blushing multiple times for the references, and as my therapist has taught me to say, instead of like, oh, it was nothing, I'm going to say, thank you all. It made me feel very good. I came off to say a couple of quick things because this has been exactly what I was hoping to happen, because I didn't moderate this, but I'll admit I curated this panel. I said there has to be one that bring all of these topics with brilliant thinkers together into this conversation. So a couple of things to those who are still with us, quoting my dear friend and comrade Head Rock, the mayor of DC Hip Hop. If you want to change your situation, you better join an organization, right? For real, if you are not collectivizing wherever you live, work, play, or pray, we are not going to be able to confront white supremacy or capitalism or settler colonialism or heteropatriarchy. We have to collectivize with all of the challenges that that involves. Number two, I saw Ingrid already did it. I'm going to say it out loud. Once you're in an organization, then apply to join the Democracy Beyond Elections Coalition. That coalition is not for individuals, but it is for organizations. And remember, it's democracy beyond elections, not democracy instead of organizations. Next, the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network has a candidate questionnaire that includes every one of these reforms you've heard, and universal basic income, and locally owned energy and production. These are things that are very powerful. Lastly, I hate to say it out loud, but it's bubbling up that do we need a non-curated solidarity economy platform conversation kind of thing? Emily, could we invite people into the SIN listserv? It's a like I just feel like there is so much energy here, but I don't have the time to curate a whole nother thing. So I'm just going to put it into the universe.
That sounds good. I don't know that I do either, but it's good that it's out in the universe, and maybe we'll catch it when we catch our breath. Thanks, everybody. It's 1:45. We got to get off. Thank you, thank you, thank you to all the presenters. Super, super huge appreciation. Great job. Great job. Thank you.